Hello, Codins. I'm going to do a walkthrough of some improvements that I've made to Hector's Financial Tracker template. These changes help me to create a doc that replaces a very simple use case for accounting. Often, accounting solutions for small businesses are really just bookkeeping solutions, but merging my formal education with a BSBA with my informal education of having done a lot of code for most of my life, I want to give myself and then the average small business owner something that helps them produce real financial statements. And the three that I focused on so far would be the P&L, balance sheet, and statement of cash flows. Now, I am actually merging two different templates here and bringing in a third-party integration that we'll talk about later. There was a template available in the gallery back in like 2018, 2019 that was a generator for financial statements. So I'm referencing what was good in that one, but pulling in kind of the single entry style that Hector's template has, and then of course the charts and graphs. So the first key change that I made was the yearly report page. Instead of having to create a page per year or to update a formula in the, last year's report page, things like that, we just go with one yearly report page, introducing a drop down in this kind of pseudo title for the page. This drop down then changes the calculations that you see in multiple places on the page. For my drop down, I didn't manually create the drop down options either. We're pulling in an existing database that the calculations are running through and giving options from that table. So you avoid a situation where you select the year at the top and then everything goes blank because it doesn't exist. Alternatively, you could choose the blank option. So it's not going to break anything, but it just makes it a little smoother for an end user. I've also adjusted the yearly overview. Instead of having separate bar charts, we've got a line graph, and this shows year over year information. Don't worry, it's all sample data. Now, back to the dashboard. We can walk through some of the financial statements that you can generate in this doc. I'll actually start with the balance sheet because it's the closest to the original Coda doc template that I created here. The balance sheet is looking for transaction data as it relates to a fixed date and time. So we use a control value here just for the balance sheet. And then for my sake, I always make sure that it's computed correctly by giving myself that accounting equation right at the top. Here, we've just got in that monospace font, cash values. We're using the dots to align everything on the right as close as or as much as possible. And we're pulling from the database of accounts, doing some filtering here and returning the relative balance. It says that the type is wrong, but it's kind of tripping. Everything there is set up correctly. And this allows us to, of course, make changes here at the control at the top and have those changes reflected in all of the calculations below. I guess I'm not picking a good sample date here. Let's see. There we go. And this particular layout, I think, works well because if we do want to print the screen, the printout looks, I think, clean and visually like it's a financial statement. So that's why I kept that same use of a text or a code block as kind of the home for the calculations. Then moving on, the profit and loss statement. Here we've got a lot of accounts and a lot of categories that feed in. So one of the initial things I considered was that I'm typing up manually all of these different categories, which I wouldn't want to do. But I haven't yet figured out how to get the @ symbol not to show up. So this is at least, my placeholder solution. These are hard links. And then I also considered that I have a control at the top, and this control is just for my profit and loss statement. So for this income statement period here, I'm going to reference that control when doing my calculations, but I might once in a while, I might want to see what transactions relate to this specific category. So I created a view of this transactions database that correlates directly to my P&L. And that way I can recalculate that same balance that I see on the P&L and see a filtered list of my transactions, again, that correlate to that time period on the P&L. If I were looking at another view of this same category somewhere else, I would actually see all transactions and I would see all balances. But it seemed important to me to make my experience here on the P&L as smooth as possible. So rather than hyperlinking to a view or a layout specifically that would bounce back and forward, we just have a fixed table inside of my data somewhere else that always maintains the fields I need to see for the profit and loss statement. So this doesn't line up perfectly on the right, and that's because of the links here. You know, if you don't look too closely, it does the job. And then finally, the statement of cash flows. So here I introduced some things I've never done before personally. I wanted to model what it would look like if instead of always filtering the primary database, we actually created a table in Coda that correlates to the calculations that you see here. So the formulas are shorter. There is a dedicated cash flow transactions table in Coda, and that table matches this control period at the top. Then, I'm following that same schema of naming the group or naming the account and making a computation here. But I did something a little different when it came to financing activities and bank accounts. I mostly wanted to avoid having to write over and over again the same accounts. And I was thinking about, scalability. What if the accounts change over time when you close certain financing activities, et cetera? So instead of manually writing those out, I'm using a for each formula, querying the database in question, and then returning the values that I want to appear in this section of the report. I'm using right pad and left pad to help me dynamically adjust the dots to try and get these values as close as possible to being aligned visually, but it's definitely not as consistent as if I had manually typed everything in. So that's something to keep in mind. Um, I am pretty happy with this solution, and I think it could eventually be a great solution for the P&L. Of course, I would lose the ability to link to individual categories, but if the categories change, if their titles change, or if I add additional categories, I don't have to go back and manually change things. So there are pros and cons. In particular, the one area that I wish was better is that I don't know how to get rid of this little space that appears here right before the first row whenever I'm calculating the accounts and their balances. If anybody has a solution for that, please comment. I would love to implement that because it's just the little things, it's visually just a little off. But again, this creates, I think, a really clean and streamlined look when it's time to print the report. I can change the control at the top. Everything prints pretty smoothly. So I can effectively replace that entry tier of an app like Wave. I'll skip past goals and budget because I didn't really make any adjustments there, but I will note that we've introduced transfers, and that's probably best represented by showing new categories. So traditionally, it was income and expenses, but if the goal is to replace an accounting software and really help people with some entry level accounting, we need the ability to track transfers between accounts. And that will help us make sure that our cash flow is accurate, but also liabilities and equity. So now we have transfers between liabilities, transferring between accounts just generally, and that helps us when we're filtering and we're grouping transactions in their respective reports. So finally, I love API integrations. That's kind of my specialty. So I will not be manually entering in records. The solution for me looks like, how do I automate getting financial data out of an application and then into this reporting dashboard? That's where Finta comes in. So Finta is a paid Coda pack, and I'm using Finta to bring in data from what you can see here, more than one financial institution, and it also includes Stripe, but it all comes in with the same schema. So it becomes very easy, very streamlined for me using an automation, but for sake of demonstration, I'm showing it with a button to take data from an API, house it in this synced pack table, and then trigger the creation of that record inside of my transactions database. So I'm using the same transaction ID that comes in from Finta on my transactions database for sake of matching information, and then recording additional information that comes in from Finta. Uh, I find this to be a fantastic solution for making sure nothing gets dropped. And of course, if ever I need to come back and verify the transactions with a bank statement, I can filter according to a time period, the right account, or any other information that will help me verify. For the most part, I think this is a really exciting template. It's definitely not going to be a QuickBooks replacement, but I think it's a great ZipBooks or Wave accounting alternative, especially now that Wave is moving towards all paid tiers. One other quick thing that we made a change in, I think, is the monthly cash flow page. So for a lot of calculation tables, usually you'll have to manually create a record for the time period and it'll auto calculate. And that's the case here. But I know that I don't want to sit down and create 12 rows, even if it's just once a year. So we made a button that will help us do that, starting with a list of 12 and then using the for each formula to create the actual date record for the first day of each month. We went with an add or modify rows calculation or button action. There we go. Because we wanted to be able to update a year without always generating 12 new records. So when we do add or modify rows, it gives us the ability to write over existing rows as well as create new ones. So I've intentionally left November out of this list so that we can model what it looks like to click the button, and it will create a record for November, but it doesn't create a whole new set of 12 records. So a little bit of buttons to help cut down on the regular maintenance of a Coda doc that you might depend on and may not want to do a little bit of chores all the time. So these are some of the changes, improvements, if you consider them to be improvements that allow me to do basic financial reporting inside of Coda. And I'm going to continue to tinker in and move into this document. So I'll probably continue to make improvements after that fact, but was excited to share with everyone.